Um, our next pair of papers, we think we're ready and right on time, so it's a seamless transition, apparently. So our next paper is by the London Classicists of Color, entitled Building Communities and Networks for POCs in Higher Education. London Classicists of Color, founded in January 2021, is a society led by a committee of classics students from the University of London, hoping to create a safe space, community, and support network for students of color studying classics across the university. They are also committed to continuing the education of all classicists and the general public in matters surrounding decolonization and race. Since their founding, LCOC has hosted regular socials, pastoral sessions, workshops, and speaker events for students and the general public, welcoming everyone committed to or interested in the decolonization of classics and building an inclusive, welcoming community within the discipline. Our speakers today are Natasha Rao, Asia Choudhury, Reina Jani, and Mai Sanadia, and they will correct me if I have in any way failed to live up to the reality of their pronunciations. All current or ex-UCL classics or ancient world students, and all of whom are founding and committee members for LCOC. So without further ado, if you would reveal yourselves, turn on your cameras. I'll mute myself and off you go.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and to the organizers of the conference for creating this amazing space and for discussing these kinds of issues. We're really pleased and honored to be here. So I'm Reina, the incoming president and the outgoing welfare officer for LCOC. We also have May, the society's media and communications officer, Asia, the outgoing president, and Natasha, one of the academic events officers. This paper is an introduction to the activities of London Classicists of Colour, or LCOC for short, and explores some of our experiences and thinking around the importance of creating communities for people of colour, or POCs, in the study of classics. Our focus will be primarily on the experiences of classics at an undergraduate and early postgraduate level as they begin to navigate a discipline which is often exclusionary, inaccessible to those of a minority ethnic background. We will be exploring some of the means by which we, as a student society, have sought to tackle these issues through the creation of POC student networks and communities, and also discussing some of the challenges which we have faced in this endeavour in the year and a half since we were founded. With a short explanation of who we are. LCOC is a student society led by a committee of classics and ancient world students from the University of London, or UOL for short. Our aims as a society are threefold. We aim to create a safe space, community and support network for students of colour by studying classics across UOL. We also wish to provide a platform for such students to lobby for changes to the curriculum and other areas of university life. And finally, we are committed to the education of all students and the general public in matters relating to classics, decolonization, and race. Our paper today focuses on the first of these three aims, the creation of student networks. LCOC was formed in response to a number of issues which we as a committee identified in early 2021. Principal amongst these was our perception that there was a lack of organised network of POC student classicists within London, a lack which had only been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. This lack of a safe space first became clear to our committee after an attempt by UCL's Greek and Latin faculty in late 2020 to organise a student panel discussion to discuss questions of decolonization and race in classics. Whilst the conversation was engaging and positive to begin with, it was abruptly disrupted by a comment from a student who expressed his frustration that he, as a white male, in fact felt that he was in the minority at the event and was being discriminated against. The safe atmosphere that had been cultivated throughout the call therefore suddenly turned tense and uncomfortable, and the call ended shortly afterwards. It was after this event that some of us expressed our desire for a safe space for POC students in London to talk about their experiences in classics and the many issues that the discipline needs to grapple with in terms of its historical relationship with colonialism, imperialism, and race. We decided to form a student society dedicated to creating such a safe space and promoting education and change around such issues.
Sorry, can you hear me? My internet's been a bit patchy. All right. Turning more closely to the topic of today's paper, it is worth taking a step back to think about why exactly it is important to create POC networks and communities in higher education before exploring the challenges of creating and sustaining such networks. In the first instance, while these sorts of statistics will no doubt be familiar to those who are here, it is important to emphasize the severe underrepresentation of POCs within classics. According to the Departmental Context Survey of 2018 to 2019, which took responses from 16 different classics departments across different types of departments and universities, only approximately 1.4% of the staff identified as Black and minority ethnic, or BAME, in a context where approximately 13.8% of the UK population identifies as BAME. This lack of representation of BAME, or visibly diverse staff members, has a strong impact on undergraduate or prospective undergraduate POC classics students. As reported in CUCD's Equality and Diversity Report in 2020, a key obstacle identified to the recruitment of BAME undergraduate students in classics was a lack of role models within classics departments. We see, therefore, a repeated pattern in which lack of visibility of working BAME classicists results in a perception at a student level that the discipline of classics is not one in which they are welcome, resulting in fewer POC students at the undergraduate and postgraduate level. This cycle is then perpetuated as later generations of POC students in classics similarly lack visible role models amongst the faculty and may choose not to pursue further study for this reason. POC networks help to mitigate this issue by creating the visibility of those BAME staff working in the field to prospective and existing BAME students, who are in turn more likely to be inspired to pursue classics at a higher level. Similarly, the existence of networks for POC classicists at university student level, provided that such networks are publicized to prospective students, can work to encourage secondary school students to enter classics at the undergraduate level. However, representation and recruitment is, of course, not the end of the story, and POC communities have an equally important role in ensuring that existing POC classics students feel comfortable and welcomed in the field. As summarized in the CUCD Equality and Diversity Report in 2020, discrimination is a serious problem in classics, as in other areas of university life. Amongst other minority groups, BAME colleagues feel disproportionately affected by it and frequently witness discriminatory behavior. BAME colleagues are also more likely to feel that they have not received effective advice and support in their career development, and are more likely to be thinking of leaving the profession than their white peers. This is reflected in the many experiences that have been shared with us by POC classics students within the University of London, and indeed the experiences of our own committee, and is born out of the many microaggressions and practical difficulties faced by such students every day during their degrees, from assumptions made about their backgrounds, knowledge, and interests to having to work with textbooks which actively employ outdated and often racist terminology. POC classics students face an uphill battle in being able to engage positively with classics in a way that their white peers can sometimes take for granted. In this context, POC-only safe communities can provide a lifeline for such students to discuss the issues which they're facing and help them feel less isolated. This is particularly important in the context of race and experiences of racism, as students may otherwise have no other space in which they feel able to be vulnerable enough to open up in fear of facing judgment, disbelief, or even defensiveness from their white peers of the kind discussed earlier. Finally, there is a need to address the way in which classics, as a specific discipline, can exclude POCs in the way it is framed. In particular, the whitewashed narratives of antiquity, which are offered by classical scholarship, the inherent assumption of the superiority of ancient Greek and Roman culture over other ancient cultures, including, importantly, the inherent superiority of ancient Greek and Latin over languages such as Sanskrit, Persian, Hittite, and Elamite, and the prioritization of a Western classical canon of literature, which devalues the contribution of the non-white writers and scholars, together create a field which works to exclude POCs and their contributions to the discipline. This has been identified as an active deterrent to the prospective POC classics undergraduates, as exemplified by the findings of the CUCD in 2020. Prospective students were found to have been put off by the perception of classical studies as elitist and the predominance of the study of dead white European men whom such students did not feel connected to. This also carries through to POC classic students' lived experience, from the lack of non-white voices on reading lists and the lack of non-traditional subjects in the classics curriculum to the devaluation of what is termed me-search when students attempt to study or explore the voices of racial minorities in the ancient world, or the reception of classics in non-white communities. Together, these experiences again serve to exclude and marginalize POC classic students and discourage them from pursuing further study or indeed a career in the field. In this context, we believe that the creation of POC communities and networks is again highly beneficial in allowing students to connect with other students, and indeed academics, whose research interests may be similar. This can provide them with access to resources and assistance when they may not be otherwise able to locate within their own departments, and potentially with access to POC mentors or guides higher up in the academic ladder who can help them to navigate an otherwise white-dominated field. Further, and importantly, POC classics communities can also provide POC students with platforms to lobby for change, whether at the student or faculty level. Turning now to the practical, we can think about ways in which communities can be created for POC classicists in higher education.
So on this slide, we have set out some of the ways in which LCOC has tried to create such support networks over the past year and a half. Firstly, and as noted earlier, it was of paramount importance for us to create a safe space for POC students to discuss issues and problems around race, which they had encountered in their academic life. Therefore, our welfare officer holds regular pastoral sessions for students to come and discuss these issues in a welcoming and judgment-free environment. These pastoral sessions are complemented by our regular workshops in which we bring both POC and non-POC students together to discuss potential areas for development in classics university departments, whether this is the requirement to study ancient Greek and Latin or the lack of non-traditional classics subjects on the curriculum. These events together, therefore, work to provide a community of POC students to address any race-related issues which they encounter in the course of their studies, both from a personal and a practical perspective. More widely, we have sought to create a wider network for UOL POC classics students by connecting them to classicists of colour within the academic community, namely POC academics and researchers. This has most often taken the form of academic talks run by our society, in which the speaker discusses their research and then takes part in a Q&A session with the audience, which can include both UOL students and members of the wider public. These talks have historically focused on one of three key areas. Firstly, race and ethnicity in the ancient Greek and Roman world. Secondly, research on non-Greek or Roman ancient worlds, such as the ancient Near East or ancient India. Or thirdly, reception of classics in a global context. And we've been lucky enough to host speakers such as Dr. Feroz Vasunia, Dr. Nandini Pandey, and Dr. Bobby Shinyu in the past year. We've also sought to host events which bring POC students closer to the academics in question, such as informal Q&A sessions in which students can pose questions to academics about their career path, research, or other related areas. Finally, an essential part of creating a network for UOL POC students has been connecting and collaborating with like-minded ventures and communities whose work is very much in line with our own aims. In particular, we've been honoured to collaborate on specific events with Sportula Europe, whose audience will be aware spoke at last year's conference, the University of Nottingham Classics Society and the Christian Coal Society, an equivalent student society that runs out of the University of Oxford and whom we understand will be speaking later today. By widening our network to include other universities and bodies, we hope to empower UOL POC students by connecting them with other POC classicists and like-minded people. What then have we learned as a society about POC student networks and the best ways of facilitating them? Here are three key features which we've identified as important, though by no means exhaustive. Firstly, and importantly, such communities need to be accessible to students and the community at large. Accessibility, as we have discovered, encompasses a number of aspects. Firstly, physical accessibility. We have tried to ensure that as many of our events as possible can be attended virtually to allow for the greatest audience and participation, although we do try to host some social and pastoral events in person in London to allow members of our society to meet one another face to face. Our virtual events are also always closed captioned and regularly live tweeted and or recorded and made available on YouTube, so that those who are unable to attend the event for any reason can watch afterwards. Secondly, we have worked to ensure our events are financially accessible to all. We do not charge for attendance at any of our events and rely solely upon donations from the public to keep our society going. Secondly, and as we've already touched upon, we feel it is key to ensure our community is kept as safe as possible for POC Classics students. We aim to achieve this not only by offering our POC-only pastoral events, but also by introducing a zero tolerance policy which applies to all of our events and which is similar to the policy which I believe is in place today, according to which we do not tolerate any behaviour that threatens the well-being of our communal space. Should any such behaviour occur, we are clear to all event participants that this may result in actions such as cautioning or the removal of that participant from the event. Finally, we have found that it is essential for student networks of POCs to have reach, namely that they need to actually be visible to the students whom they are intended to reach. In order to ensure we are available to as many London-based POC Classics students as possible, we rely on and make extensive use of social media, particularly Twitter and Instagram, on which student populations are more likely to be present and active. We also regularly attend induction sessions and Freshers Week events to make sure we are visible to incoming undergraduate and postgraduate student intakes. Finally, we have appointed dedicated student representatives from each different constituent university in the University of London. For example, we have reps from UCL, King's College London, Royal Holloway and LSE, whose role it is to actively promote our events using their own student and faculty networks.
For the last part of our paper, we'll be discussing some of the challenges LCOC has faced in creating a POC student community in London and some of our learnings from those experiences. As we have already touched upon, one of the major challenges LCOC has faced is trying to build a sizable community within an already minoritized and small group by its nature. As we have already noted, POC students are vastly underrepresented within the students' classics population, which inherently creates difficulties in creating a community of any size, especially if that community is limited by geography or institution, namely the University of London. This challenge manifested especially in some of our earlier events where we actually had quite low attendance. Having been faced with this challenge, we realized that it was unsustainable for us to continue as a UCL-only committee, as we had originally envisaged, and that we needed to embrace the possibility of a committee that stretched across the different UOL institutions, not least because this would also reflect the body of students we were trying to reach. We also realized that we would need to reach out to a broader community. For example, making more extensive use of virtual events in order to reach a broader audience, and collaborating and linking up with POC academics and organizations around the UK and more globally, particularly in the US. This change in approach translated almost immediately into real life changes. Not only did attendance improve markedly at our events, as well as increased engagement on social media and otherwise, but we were able to tap into an incredibly supportive and inspiring community of classicists who were also looking to improve diversity in the field. Going forward, we are looking to extend our community even further by adopting more of an intersectional approach to our events and our network. While our key focus is, and will remain, on supporting POC students in classics, we are keen to support and to share learnings with groups who work to improve diversity in other areas of classics, some of whom are of course in attendance today. In particular, we are looking to explore the intersectional issues facing POCs and queer students in classics. And as part of this, we'll be guest speaking at one of the seminars in the upcoming ICS series, Queer in the Classical, on Monday, the 27th of June, which we of course encourage everyone here to attend. And apologies for the shameless plug. Just a quick content warning ahead of moving on to my next slide, which contains potentially offensive, racist and/or racialized language. Another major challenge that we have faced to our building a community of POC classics students is criticism from others within the classics community. This has most often come in the form of criticism around our use of the term of colour in our name, and around our choice to purportedly prioritise the welfare and needs of POCs above other underrepresented groups. In particular, we refer to an incident which took place in May 2020, shortly after our society was founded. By way of brief summary, we had arranged to host a panel discussion for Sportula Europe, a mutual aid group and solidarity network in ancient world studies, to mark their one-year anniversary. This event was publicised by Sportula on the well-known classicist academic mailing list, the University of Liverpool listserv, to which at the time none of the committee was actually signed up, but were made aware of after the event. In response to this advertisement, Sportula received two responses on the overall listserv thread, questioning why there was any need for a group at all for classicists of colour. The second of these messages is reproduced on the slide, which you can see, and I'll give everybody a few moments just to read this message now. As is clear from the message, the writer in question was critical of our society's use of the term of colour, noting that they thought it had racist connotations, and also commented that it would be better actually to encourage classics in all underrepresented groups in schools. In a later email on the same thread, which is not reproduced here, the same writer argued that LCOC's work effectively discriminated against mixed race people, for example, and ultimately fortified the segregation which it was pretending to tear down. This is only one example, albeit one of the more extreme examples, of a kind of criticism often received by our society, and no doubt other groups working in race equality, and I'm sure others who are speaking today, which tries to undermine attempts to address issues of race by arguing that there is in fact no race, that it is racist to even see skin colour, or indeed, more recently, that all lives matter. Moving away from the incident in question, as a society, and particularly one made up of students, it has not always been easy to face criticisms of this kind, which are often levelled by much more senior members of the classics community. However, as a way to manage this challenge, we have actively worked to ensure that the aims of and terminology used by our society are made explicitly clear in our communications to the public to minimize any confusion. In particular, we have included a lengthy FAQ section on our website, which addresses our aims and our use of the term of colour. And I'll read a short excerpt from this webpage now. The term classicists of colour stems from the commonly used phrase people of colour, which in its extended form is Black, Indigenous and people of colour. This term, alongside other categorising terms for race and ethnicity, has been vastly debated within modern discourse. Implicit within this discourse is the understanding, of course, that no one term can wholly represent a community. However, we have personally chosen this term as a form of reclamation and empowerment. To us, identifying ourselves as people of colour allows us to take back control of the narrative of this term, which has often been embedded in the context of white supremacy and imperialism. All committee members at LCOC self-identify as people of colour because this shapes the way that we experience the discipline. We would like to reiterate, as our name suggests, that although we support all marginalised communities within the classical field, we cannot and do not represent all marginalised communities. We feel it would be superficial to attempt to do so because we would not be able to do them all justice, given the diversity and the breadth of this exercise. However, we do aim to uplift the causes of groups that seek to represent such communities, as we are all joined in our aim to make classics a more intersectional, diverse and welcoming field for all. We also wish to emphasise that our events, excluding POC safe spaces, are open to people from all backgrounds who are willing to engage and discuss decolonisation and the representation of POCs in classics. So that's our an excerpt from our FAQ from our website. We've also been very grateful in instances such as this one to have built such a strong support network amongst other classicists working to improve equality in the discipline. In this case, we were very eloquently and generously defended on listserv by Ashley Schibber, a committee member for Sport Chile Europe, for which we were very grateful, and a link to his excellent blog post in response can be seen on this slide in case anyone is interested. Indeed, this incident is a great example of actually how affirming and positive POC networks and classics can be and why we are talking about them today. Finally, we turn to the third major challenge we have faced in creating a POC student community in London, namely the labour, time and resources involved in doing this work. As full or part-time students, sometimes also juggling employment and other commitments, it has not always been easy as a committee for us to manage this commitment of organising and running events for the student POC community. As no doubt many people present will be aware, such work is often both emotionally and mentally exhausting, particularly when it is managed on top of a full student workload. Our experience as a committee obviously falls very much within a wider trend, whereby there is an expectation and reliance on the fact that BAME students and staff will be involved in EDI work, despite the fact that this work is frequently unremunerated or unaccounted for in a wider context. In their 2020 Equality and Diversity report, the CUCD found that, as quoted on the screen, respondents identified an expectation that BAME staff will be involved in equality work or will teach on equality topics or race. The disproportionate burden of equality work tends to fall on those who feel that they are affected by the issues, namely BAME colleagues, and we would say also students. How then can we tackle this issue and the inevitability of burnout for those who seek to build POC networks? As a committee, we have made an active choice to treat the work that we do for the society like any other job. We take regularly scheduled breaks over Christmas, Easter, and the summer term, during which many of us have exams. We have regular check-ins with our welfare officer on our mental well-being, and we make sure to work around committee members' workloads and personal commitments. We also actively promote and advocate for the remuneration of those who do EDI work. Whilst we as committee members do not receive any pay for the work that we do for LCOC, we ensure that our speakers are remunerated for their time and for any reasonable travel expenses. This particular challenge is obviously far from over though, and we look forward to a future in which EDI work is appropriately remunerated and recognised within universities. In a student context, for example, such work could count towards students' undergraduate or postgraduate degree as part of a specific EDI module, or students could be allowed to take sabbaticals during their degree to focus on such work. This might also encourage wider participation in EDI work by students who may have otherwise been discouraged from getting involved because of the fact that this time and labour is currently uncompensated.
By reflecting on LCOC's own experiences over the past year and a half, we've been able to explore in more depth the reasons why it's important to create a POC community for students in classics, as well as to consider practicalities and challenges involved in doing so. Creating such networks is crucial, in our opinion, to create equality within the field of classics, providing POC students with a safe space to discuss issues and ideas, as well as opportunities to connect with similarly minded students, academics, and wider contacts, is invaluable to efforts to make classics a truly safe, welcoming, and inclusive discipline for all. We hope that our learnings, such they are helpful to anyone looking to create a similar network or community within any EDI space, and would love to hear from anyone who would like to share their experiences or ideas with us, or indeed collaborate on future events. Thanks again very much to the organisers for giving us this opportunity to speak, and we look forward to hearing your questions at the end of this session.